which to many those who you know has been serving the greater DC area since 1999 through primarily Interfaith and Thank you. Thank you so much. And November is our anniversary, so every year, this time of the year, we have this panel traffic and also our gala that's happening soon. And the work of Rumi Forum has never been alone, and we were always blessed to be with partners and allies in this part of the country and beyond. While this is our structural, physical, programmatic presence, Rumi Forum's work is founded on a philosophical presence that was envisioned by our late honorary chairman, Mr. Fethullah Gülen. And as we sit down here in this room around the country, around North America and mostly Western Europe, we are having a large variety of anniversary events, legacy events, revisiting, discussing, reflecting on his vision for humanity formulated under and mobilized under the idea of Hizmet Movement. So tonight we are joined by two leading experts who have dedicated extensive intellectual academic effort to help us better understand this phenomenon and Mr. Gülen's legacy. I am so thankful to our Center for Faith, Identity and Globalization, and to Mehmet in particular, who is running our center since its inception 3 years ago, for putting this panel. The Center for Faith, Identity and Globalization is one of our most recent excitements at Rumi Forum. While the forum has built a brand in building relationships, we also wanted to have a research and publication brand, and thanks to Mehmet's extraordinary efforts, it's been around for 3 years now and releasing cutting-edge, scholarly informed work on the arena of faith and society. So I encourage each and every one of you to check the website, to look at the publications at the booth behind this room, and of course make this tonight's gathering a valuable opportunity to reflect on what Gülen stood up for and to make more connections as we move forward. So thank you once again, and I invite Mehmet to lead us for the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this special panel discussion hosted by the Center for Faith, Identity and Globalization, CFIG. Today's program, Fethullah Gülen's Legacy and the Hizmet Movement's Forward Trajectory, marks a deeply meaningful occasion, the first anniversary of Fethullah Gülen's passing. As the honorary chairman of the Rumi Forum, Mr. Gülen was a visionary teacher, thinker, and advocate for peace, education, and service. His lifelong commitment to dialogue, learning, and compassion continues to inspire individuals and institutions worldwide. This evening is an opportunity both to honor his enduring legacy and to reflect on the evolving mission of the Hizmet Movement, which promises to be an inspiring and thought-provoking conversations of remembrance, dialogue, and shared vision for a more inclusive and compassionate world. We are especially honored tonight to feature two distinguished CFIG scholars who have deeply studied Gülen's thought and the Hizmet Movement. Dr. Ori Z, our 2023 Rumi scholar, is the author of A Heart Not Divided by Time, Mr. Fethullah Gülen and Jalaluddin Rumi. And Anwar Alam, our 2024 Hizmet scholar, is the author of Dislike by Opposing Ends, Understanding Shared Hostility Towards the Hizmet Movement by Turkish Secularists and Islamists. We are also delighted today to announce the publication of our 2025 Hizmet scholar, Dr. Carrie O'Rourke, her paper, Education as Nonviolent Resistance, Oral Histories from the Hizmet Movement is just published, which reflects her doctoral research from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So as Ibrahim mentioned, I will encourage you to check out those publications on the back before your leave. We are also delighted to have this 25 years of legacy for Rumi Forum that has built bridges across diverse faith communities, strengthening relationships and fostering understanding locally and globally. The establishment of CFIG represents the next step in this journey, combining scholarship with dialogue to explore issues such as religious freedom, interfaith engagement, and conflict resolution. Through research, publications, and events like today's, CFIG seeks to inspire meaningful conversation and action rooted in service, compassion, and pluralism. We are also delighted to have Dr. Lyndsey Eksili with us this evening as our moderator. Dr. Eksili is an educator, writer, and advocate for holistic development and mental health with nearly 2 decades of leadership experience in education. She currently serves as the editorial director for youth titles at Tura Books and as a content editor for Fountain Magazine, where she helps shape thoughtful, faith and youth-centered publications. Through her work, she continues to champion empathy, resilience, and early intervention for educational and community settings. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Lyndsey Eksili. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here this evening with you all to moderate this really important discussion on the legacy of Fethullah Gülen and the Hizmet Movement's forward trajectory. You know, it's really interesting when we look at the way the Hizmet Movement is described. I've had the opportunity to attend several different conferences and programs remembering him. And a couple of things always stick out to me. One is the focus on education. I think we all know that. But this past weekend, there was a symposium in Virginia that was youth-led, also talking about the trajectory of the legacy of Fethullah Gülen. And there, they focused on 4 main parts of his leadership. Education was one of them, women was one of them, the youth was one of them, and nature, taking care of nature was one of them, taking care of the world around us and one another. And I thought that that was really unique when we look at how people describe leadership, to have his leadership described in kind of those 4 categories. And when I look at the work of both Dr. Soltes and Dr. Alam, I see in their work the culmination of these things coming together. So it's just interesting to see the importance of all of these good works continuing in his absence, so that it can be a reminder of how important it is to take care of the world around us all the time and everybody that embodies that world. So thank you all for being here this evening. We are going to have 2 wonderful panelists with a short discussion time after that as well. Each of our panelists will have about 25 minutes, and I'll give you friendly warnings as we come to the end. But let me read their biographies and welcome them to the stage one by one. Our first speaker will be Dr. Ori Z, a teaching professor at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization, where he teaches theology, art history, philosophy, and political history. He is the former director and chief curator at the B'nai B'rith Kletznik National Jewish Museum here in Washington, D.C., where he curated over 80 exhibitions on art, history, and culture. Dr. Soltes has lectured at major museums across the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, and the National Gallery, and has appeared on CNN, the History Channel, and Discovery Channel, sharing insights on religion, art, and ancient civilizations. He is the author of numerous books and essays, including Embracing the World, Fethullah Gülen's Thought and its Relationship with Jalaluddin Rumi and others, and Between Thought and Action, an intellectual biography of Fethullah Gülen. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Soltes. You can have a seat right here. And I will call. You can't talk yet, almost.
That's good.
Next, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Anwar Alam, who has joined us all the way from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, traveling through India to be here with us in Washington today after just having left a week ago for another program, so thank you very much. Dr. Alam is a professor of international relations at Alatu International University in Bishkek and a distinguished fellow at the Policy Perspectives Foundation in New Delhi. He previously served as Deputy Vice Chancellor at Nile University of Nigeria and as Professor and Director at the Center for West Asian Studies at Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi. Dr. Alam has been a recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship in Germany, and has lectured widely at universities and think tanks around the world. His research focuses on West Asia, Indian politics and foreign policy, Islamic movements, and Muslim politics. He has authored and edited numerous books and articles, including For the Sake of Allah, The Origin, Development, and Discourse of the Gülen Movement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. All right, so we can begin now with our talks here. I will just pass this around.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be involved with anything that involves the Rumi Forum, the Hizmet Movement, and Fethullah Gülen, Hoca Efendi. I was asked to talk this evening about something that I have spoken or written about before, which is jihad. Not a word that falls lightly on the ear of many Americans, but jihad in the life and being of Fethullah Gülen. So I begin by reminding you that that term, which simply means struggle, comes in three different kinds of flavors or with three different directions in Islam. So primary jihad is the struggle with myself to make myself a better person, to make myself, small m, a better Muslim, someone who submits to God's will more effectively. The second form of jihad is within the Muslim world, to make it more effectively Muslim. And the third kind of jihad is in the world at large. Needless to say, the term has been hijacked continuously throughout history, including up to the present time, and mistaken for something that refers exclusively to the making of war that involves Muslims and non-Muslims. That is a distant version of the third form of jihad, and it could not be further from what I mean when I speak of jihad in the context of Fethullah Gülen and his life. He was born to a pair of parents who were both eminent scholars and pious Muslims. His father was an imam. His mother was his first teacher of Quran. And when I think of jihad in his context, I think the first time he would have had a struggle was when in elementary school in Ataturk's Turkey, which was designed to be a strictly secular Turkey, inspired as he was, not because of his parents, but because of him. He had siblings. None of his siblings became him. So it's not just his parents, it's whatever it was that he had that made him unique, such as the kind of memory and mind that made him a hafiz before he was into his teens, someone who had memorized the entire Quran. But he wanted to pray because he understood that as a good Muslim I should be praying 5 times daily, and if I'm in school, that means that encompasses a time frame in which I should be doing that. And he encountered a teacher who pushed back very hard against his right to do that. So already as a kid, you might say, he engaged in jihad of a particular sort. And when I think about him as a personality and the sort of things with which he would have struggled, I think probably the most profound jihad that he endured relatively early in his life, by relatively early, I mean in his 20s and early 30s, was his turning to his mother, whom he adored, and who, like every Turkish mother, above all things wanted him to be properly married. And having located the trajectory of his life, said to her, they tried once, they tried twice, this is going to be the last time, son. I won't be a good husband, I won't be a good father, because I am so engaged and committed in the work that is starting to spread out before me. So I imagine that to his dying day, it bothered him that that one time he had to say no to his mother. But the trajectory that he had begun to define was one that took him within and well beyond the norms of what we might call Muslim piety, or the kind of Muslim piety that was unacceptable in Ataturk's Turkey, but still creeping around the underground, where Ataturk was not aware, or those who succeeded him were not aware of it. It's ironic or interesting that one could become an imam, provided one had followed the course of study that the state approved, and so he did that. But it was in that capacity that he came to recognize in his early 30s that he felt of Turkish youth, that it was kind of adrift. And that part of the reason that it was adrift was that it had lost touch with its roots. And after all, Turkey had been a Muslim country at that point for hundreds and hundreds of years, so in particular, those roots. Turkish youth was deracinated. And he also realized, of course, that when he stood up to offer a sohbet at the Jummah services on a Friday, there was no one in the mosque except a few old people. Notably missing were the young ones. And that if he was going to somehow play a role in grounding Turkish youth, which was afloat, he would have to go where they were and not expect them to come where he was. So uncharacteristic of your everyday imam, he went out into coffee shops, and I'm not talking about high-end coffee shops that any tourist would be visiting. I'm talking about scrudgy kind, and I made up that word, scrudgy, by the way. Scrudgy kind of locations where that's where the kids were hanging out. And he would get into conversations with them, and they would ask him questions. And so one realizes two things about him already. One is that the nature of his unique intellect was not limited to a memory that could commit the whole Quran before he's out of his childhood, but also it turns out he had the kind of mind that was very analytical, and he could discuss ideas, and he had the kind of idea that was broad and inquiring, as much as he had swallowed up everything one can imagine that a Turkish Muslim scholar should have swallowed, from Quran to Hadith to the lives of the saints, to the various and sundry commentaries and the different directions that different madhabs of Sharia have taken. He was also interested in, and it's a good thing that he was, because the youths with whom he was having conversations were interested in other stuff, physics and chemistry, nature, the world at large, Sartre. And so his conversations would have been far-reaching. And we also recognize of him that he both possessed a kind of charisma that compelled these young people, but also a kind of honesty and integrity, so that when someone would ask him a question that he couldn't answer, he's a smart dude. He could surely have come up with some answer that would have been half-baked. That wasn't his approach. As a pedagogue, as a teacher, and as a person who was so incontrovertibly honest, he would say, you know, I can't answer that question. Come back tomorrow and I'll have an answer for you. Which meant not only that he kept drawing them back and seducing their minds to more questions and more dialogue, but that he himself, whose formal education, aside from what set him towards the imamate, was only up to the 8th grade, was having to teach himself all of this other material. And he had the capacity to be able to do that. Again, an intellect that was both an eidetic memory, clearly, but also analytical. And he would be able to answer. And his renown started to spread throughout and across Turkey, because kids started to record his sohbets in the coffee houses. And so he became more and more known as time went on. And that led to another kind of jihad, in that the better known he became, the more threatening he appeared to be to the government, a succession of governments, whichever government. There's a point at which he is for 5 years on the run, because he does not want to stay with any friends, because it would be both an inconvenience to them and perhaps a danger. He spent time in prison. I mean, this is not new information, but it was a unique kind of jihad to be who he was within a context where, on the one hand, the secularists didn't like him because this guy's trying to turn Turkey into Iran. And on the other hand, the Islamists didn't like him because he has too many conversations with the wrong kind of Muslims. And eventually, of course, his vision would expand. And he realized it's not about Turkish youth, it's not about Muslim youth, it's about youth. It's about the world. And in order to fix the world, which is what needs to be fixed and not just Turkish youth, I need to be aware of, I need to be conversant with, I need to embrace traditions beyond my own and realize that we are, as it were, all engaged in the same struggle, in the same jihad, if we just understand that and work together. So he is operating simultaneously, in a certain sense, in two directions. One, he realizes that he's got to provide a wherewithal for people like himself who came from Eastern Turkey without access to the kind of education to which at that time in his childhood he did not have access, to gain it. So if I can provide schools where kids can come to Izmir or Istanbul or wherever it is, that would open up doors and windows to them and connect them to the world in ways that they otherwise won't be able to do so. But he also realized that it's one thing to provide a school for a kid who comes from somewhere east and without the wherewithal can barely get to Izmir. But then what happens when I get to Izmir? What am I going to do there? I mean, where am I going to live? And how am I going to fare in this chaos of the city? And so he realized I also have to create living situations, what came to be known as white houses, excuse me, lighthouses, so that kids would have a place to stay. And they would also have, he started a system of older kids who were helping younger kids, abis. Not just helping you with your physics homework or helping you negotiate your studies, but helping you negotiate Izmir, helping you negotiate life. All of this became part of this project. So this is one thing, right? But that's a nice theory, isn't it? There have been any number of people over the course of history who have had great ideas of what they'd like to do if they could, but they don't know how the could works out. So in addition to the intellect and the charisma that drew students in, he also had the kind of charisma that made it possible for him to turn to individuals with the wherewithal to provide the funds, not only to create the schools, but also to create these dormitories, these lighthouses. And one of my favorite stories about him is he goes to visit someone who's already a patron. And he says, I see you've got 2 bedrooms in your house, beautifully furnished. Obviously that one's for your wife and yourself. Who's the other one for? Oh, that's for my son. Where is your son? Oh, he's off in Istanbul. I don't think he's coming back. Fine, I'd like the furniture from his room to help me find furniture for the dorm. So he is developing this extraordinary network, and at the same time, his jihad is not to run afoul of the government, and running afoul of the government, what to do about it. His jihad becomes to broaden his vision so that in the long run, it's not just, as I said about Turkey, it's not just about Muslim youth, it's not just even about his own knowledge, because he's studying everyone from Socrates to Einstein, from Ibn Arabi to Rumi, to Said Nursi, to Newton. His range of areas of understanding keeps broadening and deepening. And his vision of the world as one that needs to be fixed keeps broadening. And he starts to think about the various elements. Obviously, ignorance is an issue, and education is necessary. And we already heard what Lyndsey just said a moment ago, and we'll, I'm sure, hear more about it, but the whole educational system that he created over the course of time was designed to solve that sort of problem. But he realized that poverty is also an issue. So we have to create programs that will fight against poverty. And above all, he became aware of how strife-ridden the world is. And we have to figure out a way to end that by creating programs that bring people from diverse backgrounds together. And the idea that he was developing was the idea called hoshguru, which many of you know, which when I first encountered it with my first encounters of Gülen and the Hizmet movement was unfortunately translated into English as tolerance. And the whole point is that that's a bad translation because tolerance means I'm here and you're there and I tolerate you. Hoshguru, if you take it apart, it's seeing the world from someone else's eyes. So it's embrace. It's an even playing field. And that's that's what he was preaching. That's what he was teaching. That's what he was writing about in essay after essay, in poem after poem, in book after book. And sometimes the various programs work together. There's a program that I saw in Melbourne, Australia. I also saw it in Berlin, Germany, where the 11th and 12th graders in a Hizmet school are tasked with raising organic vegetables because they're in neighborhoods where you can't get them. They sell the organic vegetables to the neighbors. Of course, it creates good relations with the neighborhood. But then they're further tasked with researching, and in both cases, it was a little village, one in Mali and the other was in, I forget, it was a different African country. In both cases, the village was over a mile from a water source, a fresh water source. And so they send the funds that they earned from selling the organic vegetables to that village and made it possible to put a piping system in to bring fresh water for the village. So they're doing several things at the same time. Raising the organic vegetables in the first place is a different kind of education from what you get in books. It's understanding what is involved with that, how the farmer has to be concerned about the weather and about the insects and all of that. So it's a holistic kind of process. And of course, every Hizmet school, if on the one hand it follows the dictates of whatever the country in terms of what you may or may not do, every Hizmet school, at least the 25 or 30 that I have visited, have been consistent in the following two ways. The range of the curriculum that goes from science and art to language and literature to sports. So the body and the soul, everything is encompassed except for one thing, religion. Religion is not being taught because when you teach it, you can end up promoting yours, you can end up preaching it and not teaching it, so that's the one thing that's not found in the Hizmet schools. And the other feature is that their students consistently do so well. And you wonder, why is that? And then you visit with the teachers and the administrators, and it's because you're dealing with people who were inspired by Fethullah Gülen to perform true Hizmet service, where I do what I do not because I'm expecting a payback, but because I should. And I'll come back to the should in a moment. And so teachers and administrators who are not spending 5 days a week, 9 to 5, but are spending 7 days a week, 5 to 5, 5 to 9. And I saw this again and again in the different places that I had visited. Hizmet as an altruistic series of actions, not as something you do for recompense. There is a recompense. For Fethullah Gülen himself, and for those who are inspired by him, for the most part of what Hizmet is about is, I want a relationship with God, with Allah. I love God. God made everyone. God made everything, nature and not just humans. If I love God, and if I want, and I hope that God loves me, I have to love everyone. I can't pick and choose. I have to serve because I'm doing God's will, but I have to add a footnote to that, which is that Hoja Effendi once made the comment, you know, atheists who are doing good things are doing God's work. They just don't know it. So your inclination doesn't even have to be a religious one. this leads into the last sort of thing, the last jihad that I want to talk about. And that is, along the way, Fethullah Gülen encountered someone, a rising politician, the mayor of Istanbul, who he thought was on the same plane, on the same page. The idea that democracy and Islam go hand in hand, and that the future of a stable Turkey is one in which those two systems operate. And that individual, of course, was Mr. Erdogan. And for the most part, between 2003 and let's say close to 2013, well, maybe 2011, 12, contrary to popular belief, they were never friends. But Mr. Gülen saw in Mr. Erdogan someone who had the same ambitions for Turkey as did he, and someone who could be a partner in the process. The problem, of course, as you probably all know, is that by 2011, 2012, Mr. Erdogan began to feel very comfortable in his position of power and felt no longer the need to be partners with someone like Fethullah Gülen, who, in fact, he feared was someone who had political ambitions, not understanding at all that Mr. Gülen came from a place called civic and civil Islam, and not the place from which Erdogan comes, which is called political Islam. They're two very different places. By 2013, as I'm repeating what you probably know, but nonetheless, by December, of course, there was a scandal, a corruption scandal, and that created the final break, as it were, in that relationship. And Mr. Erdogan very carefully planned how he would usurp the various elements of power within Turkey, culminating with a coup that he fabricated in July of 2016, that because by then he controlled the media as well as taking control of the police, was on the edge of taking control of the army, was taking control of the judiciary and the legislature, was able very easily enough to present the false idea that this was a failed coup initiated from Pennsylvania by Mr. Gülen, rather than the fake coup that it was initiated from Istanbul by Mr. Erdogan. And still to this day, you will find journalists who should know better, because they're not doing their research, who still present that as the failed coup, the failed coup, the failed coup, including a year ago in the various obituaries of Fethullah Gülen, you would find reference to that. Of course, the outcome was that Erdogan began a sustained series of attacks on Hizmet in particular. The failed coup, the fake coup, provided him with the divinely given excuse to attack Hizmet, analogous to the model offered to him by his model, Adolf Hitler, whose people burned down the Reichstag in Berlin in February of 1933 and managed to convey the idea that it was the communists and then subsequently the Jews who were part of a conspiracy that had brought that to an end. So the consequence of all this, the attacks on Hizmet, the closing down of schools, the bribery where he can do it, the bullying where he can do it, if one doesn't work the other, he being Mr. Erdogan, created an enormous jihad for Mr. Gülen. The struggle to stay above it, the struggle not for himself, because he remained forever calm. And he constantly preached Raj, Sabr, hope, patience, but not to allow his by then worldwide array of followers to be full of despair because of what Erdogan had done, I think in a certain sense became his final jihad. We end up with a kind of irony, because Gülen already in the 90s was sending people out into the world. He already had come to understand that if it's the world overall that needs repairing, it's not just Turkey, then people who are performing Hizmet for the world have to go out into the world. After all, within the Quran itself, we read, I have created you of different tribes that you may know one another, and Gülen took that very seriously. So he's already sending people out. So the irony is, after 2016, more and more Hizmet people are forced out of Turkey and out into the diaspora. I will not pretend that it is not a painful diaspora for people who would like to be able at least to go home and visit, for people who maybe have a parent who is ill, whom they can't visit, they can't go back. I'm not going to pretend that's not so, but the irony is Erdogan has failed in that the diaspora that he has made necessary is, albeit from a different angle, the very diaspora that Fethullah Gülen would have wished for his followers to engage in. So in these last years of his life, 2 more levels of jihad. It'll take me 1 minute. One is the whole secret of empowering leadership. You may have noticed Hizmet did not fall apart a year ago when Mr. Gülen passed. If any of you were at the funeral with thousands and thousands of people in that stadium, no outcries, not a piece of garbage after everyone was gone. The people who were in charge for security couldn't believe it. Who are these Hizmet people? That the leadership, more and more he would say when someone would come and ask him a question, what should I do? He'd say, I don't live in Melbourne, you do. I don't live in DC, you do. You have to figure it out. So he was gradually, very distinctly handing over the reins of power to others, and not to an other, but to others. And that sharing of that is what has continued in the years since. His jihad in the last several years to promote more and more the gender parity that had always been his vision, but as a good leader, you don't run too far in advance of your constituents. Within Turkish culture, the kind of gender level operation that Gülen had envisioned was not common, and he wasn't going to suddenly start doing this. But if you notice how things have operated across the Hizmet world in the last several years, that has become more and more and more common. So that in the end, he's really engaged in all 3 forms of jihad, isn't he? The jihad to make himself constantly a better Muslim, a better person. But also he is improving the Muslim world, capital M, not through warfare, not through wordfare, but through the action that just makes us better. And thirdly, improving the world at large by making us all better. Our jihad is now to carry forth his legacy. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. You reminded me of when Fethullah Gülen said that the Muslims might be the brothers and sisters by faith, but humanity, they're my brothers and sisters simply by being human.
Exactly.
And that really, everything you kind of talked about just wraps it up really well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything. Next we have Dr. Alam here, who's going to have 25 minutes as well. I will give a gentle reminder to you when you have 5 minutes to go as well.
Thank you, Lyndsey.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Let me begin by really thanking the organizer of this event for inviting me and giving me this wonderful opportunity to have interaction with all of you on a very important issue, and that is recalling and connecting with the ideas of Fethullah Gülen, which essentially mean that as Dr. Ori said, that going back to Turkey, what happened, and it is essentially within this larger context. There are a few things which I would like to mention before all of you. One is that what comes to my mind is that what happened to Fethullah Gülen and his legacy and Hizmet movement in Turkey, in a sense, is that the way the movement has been suppressed, repressed, ostracized, dehumanized, it could become possible this way when there is a huge gap between the ideas of Fethullah Gülen and the ideas of Hizmet movement and the rest of the society. From this point of view, I would like to take the position that Fethullah Gülen was far, far ahead than the contemporary generations, people were not in a position to really receive that kind of the ideas. And that is why that gave a very temporary kind of edge to many of these state-centric voices as such. There is one problem with the discourse of, the kind of the very more modern knowledge production in which we all grow, the kind of school educations and the university system, wherever education has really been organized. It's somehow probably that the people with religious background or with religious vision, or who develop the capacity to articulate their reason in the religious terms like Fethullah Gülen or even Gandhi, will not be considered as someone as systematic thinker. Unless and until you basically organize your argument within the secular epistemology, within the typical modern language, only then you will be considered as an intellectual. Otherwise, you may become Pandit, Maulana, other kinds. So that's how you have been basically categorized. That's basically a limitation within which we basically operate. But the fundamental questions that probably comes to our mind that, and which is a very, very common sense, and that is the task given by Mehmet Bey to me, is that if Hizmet Movement and Fethullah Gülen did so much wonderful things in Turkey, in terms of providing education, in terms of opening the dialogue centers, in terms of, for example, bridging the gap. I mean, if you look at, for example, Turkish societies, and I got this opportunity to live in Turkey for almost 5 or 6 years, doing all kinds of the field works, and probably any book that you will open on Turkey, you will find this. That in this kinds of popular understanding, we have been basically told, and several times we have been told that in Turkey, that there is a great battle on between the Muslims and Kemalists and secularists. There are great battles going on. And therefore within Turkey you heard these two terms, one is called I was not aware, but when I started living in Turkey, I get to know that there are two terms in Turkey. One is white Turks, another is black Turks. But then everybody was fair actually, nobody black. So I really got confused, what kind of, this terminology. Much later I really get to realize that the white Turks essentially means those Kemalis, anti-religious, secular people who hold a very high position within the state, or within the various structures of the states, and they are the privileged one, and they dominate the political economy. And those who come from Anatolian background, religious backgrounds, practicing Muslims, marginalized, economically poor, who doesn't have a place in the states, who are not formally very much educated, so they are basically black Turks. So it's a kind of classification, a distinction between the haves and the haves not. So that's the discourse that you really, really find. And Fethullah Gülen has remarkably, through this educational experiment, produced this entire, what is called the social justice, bringing these so-called black Turks into the mainstream, empowering them, other things, this and that. But then, at the end of the story, what you find is that the movement has been criminalized. Even Fethullah Gülen has been excommunicated. What is very interesting is that in the tradition of Sunni Islam, there is no provision of excommunication. But in Turkey, the person has been excommunicated beyond the pale of Islam. No, that's very, very interesting. And that is why I find that why this really basically happened. And to my understanding, if this is basically a popular story, one would like to see that after 15 years of the AKP rule in Turkey, there will take place automatically a marginalization of this secularists, Kemalis, anti-religious, or who's anti, the AKP has done politics actually. Right from very, very since the beginning actually. But then instead of that happening, Hizmet and Fethullah Gülen has been marginalized. Nothing happened to Kemalists, nothing happened to CHP except such kind of token exercise. And the kind of brutality, even like for example, if you live in Turkey, the mainstream Turkeys and all, I mean, if somebody talked to you about PKK, like Kurds and the others, but nothing happened to that kind of like repression to PKK families or their businesses or their enterprise. What happened to, for example, the followers and the sympathizers of the Hizmet movement actually? I mean, their property were just confiscated. We all know that. I mean, the deals were basically robbed. So such kind of marginalization has really never happened in fact. So there are this couple of things when I try to understand that the net result is just opposite. The discourse is between so-called Kemalism and Islamism, but then the end product is that a so-called a Muslim government and a Muslim state basically marginalize another movement which is operating in the name of Islamic universal values. Okay, so it is not the Kemalist and the secularist. So in the discourses, what you find very interestingly is that number one, which basically takes place, that it's all about a power struggle between the Hizmet movement and AKP and Erdogan. And what is this power struggle is very interesting. The power struggle is that both Fethullah Gülen and the Hizmet movement and the AKP, they were basically allies at one point of time. Okay? But then you really do not find, that what is the nature of this alliance. Was this a programmatic alliance? Was this an ideological alliance? Was this, on what basis this alliance really came into existence actually? And this discourse essentially emerged when there were some kinds of I would say, repression started against the Hizmet movement. Prior to that, even the word alliance has never been used. I am very, very careful, and I am asserting this position, and I am asserting this position very consciously. To the best of my writing on all the books on the AKP and the Hizmet movement. Prior to this emerging conflict, both Gülen movements and the AKP has never been referred as partner to each other. It only emerged in 2012 and 2013, not before that actually. So one is very, very surprised that suddenly resurfacing of these kinds of the words, And the idea was that by 2012 and 13, Kemalis has been marginalized, I mean, military chief has been changed, police has been changed, judiciary has been changed, So once they have been marginalized in the state structures, therefore, what has been really left? Then the power struggle between the Hizmet movement and the AKP for the greater share of the state power, because the common enemy has already been marginalized. So it is too commonsensical. I mean, any story will basically, really basically get convinced actually. To my understanding actually, what I have really found is that the first of all is that describing Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gülen as someone as modernist is probably contrary to the teachings of Fethullah Gülen. Most of the books and the writings has dwelt on the Hizmet movement within the frame of Islam and modernity. I have my own reservations. It's like, for example, my own understanding is that it's like, for example, nowadays Mahatma Gandhi from India has been more discussed as a postmodern thinker, not modern thinkers. I believe that Fethullah Gülen belonged to genre. It belonged to genre of the postmodern, rather than, for example, the modern as such. For 3-4 reasons, I would take this position. One reason is that modernity itself has a very strong link with destruction. A very strong, it has a roots with violence. And this violence has really been reflected in terms of both visible and the invisible. The construction of the nation state, and its impact on the ordinary citizen, on the life, is very, very horrible. The colonization, the racism, the First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust, large number of ethnic and the political conflicts, violence has been the integral part of the modern liberal tradition, and the violence has been the integral part of the modernity. I do not think Fethullah Gülen and Gandhi would like to identify that kind of modernity or that legacy in which violence is very, very embedded. And that made me very, very cautious, you know. And therefore, for example, the debate in Turkey is something is like this. You know, Kemalists wanted a modern Turkey. A modern Turkey, but without Islam. Very clear. The Islamists wanted a modern Turkey, but with Islam. Okay? So where does Fethullah Gülen and Hizmet Movement will fix? Does he basically want, you know, a modern Turkey with Islam or what? You know, probably to the best of my understanding is that, as Fethullah Gülen tried to understand Islam in terms of the very, very universals, very, very plural, very, very diverse, very, very inclusive way, he has been probably far more concerned, what I would like to say, probably the spiritualization and the humanization of modernity. That's where he would like to stand. It's not about Islamization of modernity. It's about spiritualization and the humanization of the modernity. And that's basically a fundamental conflict between the modern vision of the development and the postmodern vision of the developments. And that's where I find one has to locate the so-called conflicts between Fethullah Gülen and the AKP and the Hizmet movements, and vis-a-vis the other kind of the modern sectors as such. One part of the problem is that it also lies with the modern social science. I do not know, I mean, to what extent Dr. Ori Z will really agree with me or not, but one of my problem with this modern European social science, I would not take the position the Indian or the non-European, but the modern European social science is that power is at the center of this modern European social science. Go back to the 15, 16, 17, 18, the last 500 years. The modern social science will not survive without the idea of power. It sees power everywhere. It sees the power here. It sees the power in the bedroom. It sees the power in family. It sees the power. It's power everywhere. You know, and therefore it is very commonsensical that you will only understand mobility, you will only understand good life, you will only understand vision of good society, you will only understand the vision of good nation, essentially in terms of power trajectory. And the more you think in that terms, the more a question of control, and the more a questions of homogenization, and the more a question of centralizations. I mean, is that the trajectory that probably Fethullah Gülen, I think I have no doubt about that actually. You know, so that's what I find a remarkable. The other discourse that you find very, very popular in Turkey is a kind of discourse, something for the first time I heard when I started living in Turkey, and it is called deep state. You know, and this is something very strange to me because I've never heard in India actually. And what is this deep state? But wherever you go in Turkey, this deep state is there. You know, some of the members within the Hizmet movement also do believe that what has happened in 2013 and 2016 and what is happening against the Hizmet is not the handiwork of even Erdogan. It is something bigger deep state than Erdogan actually. Erdogan is just one part of the story. You know, and very much globe is entire, you know, getting threatened, the Hizmet is expanding and they want to crush. There is a global and a very, you know, conspiracy kind of the theories. But many Kemalists and the secularists, when I started interviewing, they find Hizmet movement as a deep state. So both find each other as a deep state. That's very, very interesting actually, you know. So that's another very, very popular, you know, and I realized that there's no point discussing into these things in fact. So what I basically realized is that by 2011 and 12, this contradiction between these two visions became very, very sharp actually. And this vision was that it is essentially, if you live, for example, in Turkey, there is something called, I do not know, because in a Turkish historiography, something called, you know, Turkish nationalism, has really been glorified like anything actually. But then much deeper I realized that it's a more a question of being nationalist rather than you are being statist actually. Turkey has a historically very specific tradition of being statist. It is the state that basically determines your identity. So without a state, you do not have any identity. It's very interesting for me that while I was doing research in Turkey, I will talk to many professors and I'll talk to many intellectuals within media and the academia and everywhere. In the Turkish lexicography, it was very, very surprised because what was very interesting for me is that large number of academia and the media personality did not maintain any sharp distinction between nation, state, government, and community. We are all same. It's a question of degree. So when you talk about civil society in Turkey, it does not make it. There's no sharp distinction. Therefore, what happened is that if there's a crisis of government, that becomes the crisis of the Muslim community. If there's a crisis of the state, that becomes the crisis of the government. So there is no sharp distinction as such. And that partly basically. The whole idea essentially is that the state is far more centralistic, far more organized, and over the last, like for example, 1980 onwards, three things was happening in Turkey. One was you have these forces of globalization, there's no doubt about that, and forces of economic liberalization, and then forces of political liberalizations or political democratizations. Three things are happening. And the collective impact of all these three things essentially is essentially two and three things. One was the centering civil society in the national politics that never happened before. The second thing which was basically happening is that the large number of people were almost becoming free of the language and the discourse of the state because of these three things actually. And the third was basically happening was that civil society was almost becoming free state. State role in economy, state role in governance, state role, because of these three was happening. And if you look at all these things, whether it's a globalization, economic liberalization, political democratizations, if there was a one force in Turkey that was basically championing, and the champion the Euro model of democracy, it was Hizmet Movement. And that's the fundamental question actually. The fundamental question is that whether the modernists who realize that they are losing control over the state, they are losing control over the state resources, and in the name of democracy, in the name of civil society, in the name of decentralizations, that the state is becoming weaker and weaker and slipping away from their basically controls. And therefore the fundamental conflict is that on the one hand the AKP and the Kemalists and secularists, they were basically representing a kind of the late 19th century and the mid 20th century kind of the idea of modernity based on elections, centralization, homogenization, unified development, whereas Fethullah Gülen are basically representing a kind of multicultural plural model of democracies. The conflict of this vision actually is. So what would you do? And for the first time what happened in Turkey here is that it's not only that Erdogan and AKP and the state, other parties also involved in marginalizing, they are basically combined actually. So what would you do that for? Because for the first time in Turkey, whether it's for example 2013 corruptions or for example Gezi protest and all, here is for the first time a civil society is posing a challenge to the state. Now this has never happened in Turkey. This has really never happened in Turkey. People says basically so much have happened, nobody spoke in favor of Hizmet. Hizmet totally became isolated. nobody sympathizes. No, that's precisely a very, very wrong prescription. If you go into the history of Turkey, there is hardly any tradition of revolt and protest against the state. That's the fundamental question. Whatever the revolt and the protest that has come either from the Kurdish section, but it has never come from the Turkish section. There has never been any tradition to revolt, neither Fethullah Gülen has ever tried to, for example, advocate actually. So that you have to look at. It's not about there's a lack of sympathy, people are not with it, but it's all about the kind of tradition that has really come to build. And I think is that this is a kind of conflict is about vision of development, about a vision of democracies, about a vision of empowering the citizenships, about a vision of the global, about the vision of particular kind of nation and state. That is at the center of conflict between the Hizmet model of the development and the other modernist form of the development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I took so many notes. I wasn't able to keep up with everything you were saying, but I have a question for each of our speakers, and I will open it up to the floor. I want to start with you, Dr. Alam. So given your perspective on Gülen's thoughts being kind of postmodern, right, and now that they've kind of have been spread they were all over the world before, but now even more so, what should be the steps that are taken forward to ensure that the thoughts and the practices behind the teachings of Gülen are carried out without getting involved in, some of those political dilemmas that could possibly follow along the way? It's a hard question, I know.
Yeah, without going into the?
Without getting mixed up into them and having it, follow them.
But I think, for example, this 2016 conflict has already institutionalized very, very clear that the Gülen movement is something fundamentally different from the AKP. So there's no question of mixing basically anymore as such. The second is that wherever the Hizmet school has been established, I have lived in Africa, so I have seen there also. I have seen in Central Asia. I have seen in Turkey. I have seen here actually in other places. The challenge, for example, I personally believe that the challenge that we are facing today, like in terms of Modi, in terms of Trump, in terms of Putin, or what is called, for example, this liberal democratic crisis. This is a very fundamental challenge not of the political economy. It's not a challenge of migration. It's not a challenge of refugees coming. It's primarily a challenge of the kind of education within which generation has been raised. That's a fundamental challenge. Why every time this crisis will come? What kind of education that? So I think that one of the idea of this educational model of Fethullah Gülen is how to basically produce human beings. Modernity has always been concerned to produce professionals. Has always been produced to produce skilled workers. Modernity has not been concerned to produce ethical and moral generations. And that's where is the fundamental questions actually, And I see that wherever educational model, whether US and everywhere, I think that's the model. That is why what you find very interestingly is that the question which has been posed to me, that even after 2016, imagine for a while that Hizmet movement was very, very powerful phenomenon in Turkey. There's a systematic attack against you. Would you not like to hold your power? Would you not like to defend your, that's a typical thing that goes into the modernity. What you find in Hizmet is that right from 2013, since the persecution began, it's almost more than a decade, almost 15, 16 years now, till today actually, Hizmet has really not protested in any violent way. Not its members. To be honest, they don't know even how to protest. That's the whole problem. They don't know even how to hold a placard. That's the whole thing. They expect, okay, you can hold placard. I don't know. I mean, their body language is as such. So that's what I have basically called them, that Gandhian human forces. They are totally Gandhian human forces. So that's where I see that the education has really.
Thank you so much, and that ties in perfectly well with what I want to ask Ori. It's kind of twofolded. You were actually there at the same program when Dr. Anwar Alam said that the Emerald Hills of the Heart are like a diary of Fethullah Gülen.
Yes.
I wholeheartedly agree with that comment, and I think that it'll tie in well with my question. And the reason I say that is because I think it offers us advice, no matter your religious background, no matter what age you are, anything. But of all of the things that you learned about the way that Fethullah Gülen was raising the youth, so to speak, around him, in Turkey, what did you find to be the most powerful, and what do you think could be the most effective here in the States for our youth, regardless of their faith backgrounds?
He's yelling, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq. I am truth, one of the names of God, of course. And he's executed because they think he's being an apostate. What they don't understand is he hasn't been able to disconnect himself from God. It's God speaking with his voice, and he hasn't been able to pull himself out from that. So that's the danger. That's one of the dangers. You go mad, you apostatize, you die. The reward, of course, is that if you can have that kind of experience, you're in a position to do things to improve the community around you, whether it's your 5 followers or the entire planet. And of course, if that isn't your goal, if my goal is to gain enlightenment for myself, then that's too egotistical, it won't work. I won't be sufficiently emptied of self to be filled with God. If I can do that, my goal has to be to come back and improve the community around me. So that's a mystical framework, which it is a biography, an autobiography, because Gülen was too humble to admit to being a Sufi because he saw that as a kind of compliment, and he didn't like compliments. In fact, I joked at the conference that we were together in New Jersey, which was all about Gülen for 2 days. I said, I'm going to be laughing for 2 days because he'd hate this conference.
Yeah.
Because the last thing he wants is a conference about himself. What he would have wanted was the ideas that he had been spending a lifetime trying to promote. And we dishonor him if we forget that. It's not him we have to be thinking about, although we can't help not thinking about him, those of us who knew him. But it's about the ideas. So, my long-winded non-answer to your question, can I convey to young people, I who face them every week in my classes, the value of altruistic, I don't have to use the word hizmet, that just happens to be the Turkish word, altruistic actions on behalf of others. If I can do that, that's what I want to do. And maybe the prelude for me to do that is to say to my students, you need to think, all right, here's your assignment for your midterm. If you regurgitate what I said, that's okay, you'll do okay, but I really want you not to just regurgitate what you heard me say. I want you to be thinking for yourselves. I'm not saying you have to disagree with me. If you do, don't be afraid to disagree. If you agree, that's fine too. You have to think. And that would be a step towards doing for others and not just for yourself. But that's a tough nut to crack, certainly in this country. Right now, we have always struggled as a country between our giving and our taking, between our embracing immigrants and our despising immigrants. Going back to the 1820s, this isn't just new. But if we seem to be right now at a time that is more intensely self-centered, self-focused than ever before. And that's what I would like to push young people away from. And it doesn't have to be by way of Fethullah Gülen, but I would know that I'm promoting him. It doesn't have to be him.
Right.
Like I said, it's Hizmet. It doesn't have to be called Hizmet. So that's a non-answer answer.
No, that's an answer.
Okay.
Altruism, universal values, and
Sure.
ridding ourselves of our
Yeah.
egos, and
Yeah.
that's an answer.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think, how long do we have to have some questions from the audience here? Couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Who would like to ask a question? Floor is yours. Yes.
Younger or older?
I can't say that.
I can. Yes, I'm not the monitor.
Thank you guys so much for this excellent talk. You brought up that Fethullah Gülen studied from many different Islamic traditions, and you mentioned Ibn Arabi, and so I wanted to ask, how has Ibn Arabi and the Sufi philosophy tradition really influenced Fethullah Gülen in making Hizmet and his journey to life? Thank you.
Ibn Arabi in particular, Rumi, just in terms of volume of writings even more so, stand out in having written things that make it very clear that they find no contradiction between being intense Muslims, because I can't be a Sufi Muslim if I'm not starting out by being a Muslim, and between that and being universalists. And so, you know, I go into the church, I go into the synagogue, I go into the church, I see one altar, that's a Rumi kind of phrase, which is ascribed to him. He may or may not actually have written that particular phrase. But Ibn Arabi, same thing. Come join me, you know, love, that's my sanctuary, and so on. An enormous influences, I think, on Fethullah Gülen's sense of being simultaneously a very devout, pious Muslim, capital M, and a universalist who embraced everyone equally as all part of what God loves, and as a Sufi who wouldn't call himself a Sufi, who loved God and wanted to have that kind of a reciprocal relationship with God. He realized, I can't love God and not love the planet, not just everyone, but as you said, nature as well. There are stories about him, you know, taking off his shoes so he didn't get dirt on the, you know, his concern for ants, his spending all this time trying to capture this little, what do you call it, a yellow jacket, so he could put it outside, you know, that sort of thing. The stories are legion. I've not been a witness to all of them. Who knows how many of them are real and how many of them are apocryphal? It doesn't matter. It's clearly what he was about. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Do you want to add? No? Okay.
That's
Thank you. Karim from. Thank you both, very interesting remarks. Dr. Soltes, you were talking about the legacy of Gülen, and I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit about the legacy of the man Said Nursi, whom, from my understanding, the Hizmet movement is basically the child or the grandchild of. And in a way, it touches directly on the issue of jihad, because Said Nursi had a very definite and profound understanding of the Islamic jihad notion practice, which he called jihad ma'nawi, which I believe should be translated spiritual jihad.
Exactly.
And for Dr. Anwar Alam, whose the rich comments you make are perhaps too much to digest in one sitting, given the secular forces at work in Turkey today, especially through things like smartphones and consumerism, will we have to wait for the demise of Erdogan before there can be any hope of a rebirth of the Gülen movement within Turkey? Thank you.
Would you like to go first? Absolutely, of course. Said Nursi, many of his ideas in the Risale Nur we find resonant through Gülen. He was willing, initially, of course, as you know, to work with the government. They wanted him to, but when he realized that where they were going was nowhere that he was interested in going in, he withdrew, and ultimately, of course, he spent much of his time in a kind of internal exile. I'm telling you things you already know. But maybe it's just different time, different place. You know, Socrates starts the idea of dialogue, but his world is Athens. It doesn't occur to him to want to be in dialogue with the Persians or the Phoenicians. Fast forward to Gülen, and he wants to be in dialogue with the entire world. I think many of the crucial ideas from the Risale-i Nur of Said Nursi that resonate into Gülen get extended outwards to the larger world, again, just because his thinking takes him to the whole world, more so. But there are so many parallels, and there's so many resonances and so many borrowings, you're absolutely right. And a different topic for a different time would be just to talk about that. In fact, there was a conference about a year ago, I think, in Cleveland, about specifically how how Said Nursi's thinking in the Risale-i Nur will survive, or not, but it was will, through the Hizmet movement and through what it is engaged in. And so you're spot on. You're spot on about that.
But sometimes I do believe that personality do play a role in history. But then the democracy is not dependent on a single individual. So the idea is not here that if tomorrow Erdogan will not be there, democracy will return. I don't think that's the way it basically works. I think is that the democratization of a state is a very, very long process actually. I mean, if you look at, for example, the kind of Turkey that we have today, I don't see much difference between Kemal Atatürk, who remained unelected hero of Turkey. He was unelected lifelong. He never contested any election. You know, Erdogan believes in elections. He's an elected hero. But if you look at, for example, in terms of the state response to any kinds of the protest, to any kind of dissent, to any kinds of assertion, it's remained the same actually. You know, so I believe is that it is not about the individual and tomorrow Erdogan will go and things will be fine. No. Rather probably the answer lies what kind of social movement basically emerge. As long as you have a vibrancy of social movement, democracy is secured. If you do not have social movement, democracy is impaired. It's not about it. That's what I believe. And credit really goes to Hizmet movement. What it is that as long as Hizmet movement was very much prevalent and very, very active between 2002 and 2012. Now this is the period which is the golden period of democracy in Turkey. After 2012, Hizmet declined in Turkey, suppressed, marginalized, ridiculed, whatever. Since then, democracy has not returned to Turkey, no matter what Erdogan claimed. Yeah. So that's why.
Thank you for a provocative, great presentation. I want to go to the words of the title, Forward Trajectory Outside of Turkey, and ask you what you think the aspects of the movement and aspirations of the movement are that are going to be most successful, rooted in the United States or elsewhere. Thank you.
All right, I'll start. I think the simplest is to see the schools, of course, which are flourishing, and the products of those schools, as in the young people whom I have encountered across the planet, who are involved with the Hizmet movement, and the values that they have and that they promote, and what they share with their communities, and their vision for their communities and for the world. That's well, obviously, beyond Turkey. In fact, they all probably have the hope, secret or not, that they could re-inject those values back to Turkey itself, like this,
right,
to Turkey itself. And of course, as my colleague has pointed out, in Turkey itself, democracy hasn't been present yet, and it won't suddenly return when Erdogan is gone, and Hizmet won't suddenly be able to return. The water and the air are too poisoned against Hizmet there. It'll take a generation. But meanwhile, it can, will, should, must continue to do what it does around the world. And that's good things. In this country, in places you wouldn't think of, like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, And, you know, in New Zealand and in Australia and in Berlin and in Tbilisi, Georgia, so many other places, the schools and everything that comes with that, the interfaith iftar dinners that create a basis for conversation because everyone likes to converse around food, and being involved in the kind of projects, for example, in this country, where, you know, we gather to try and provide Thanksgiving meals for people who want them but can't go out to get them. And so people get together, and there are various churches, synagogues, mosques, community centers where that stuff, Hizmet is part of that. And the more that it's part of that, the more that it's just sharing what it is. And it is about walking the walk. It's not about talking the talk. I'm doing the talking, but all the Hizmet people I encounter aren't talkers, they're walkers, they're doing the doing. And that's ultimately what leaves a residue and a legacy, I think, more than words. That answers sort of, kind of, maybe.
No, I fully agree with you.
Okay. He agrees with me.
We are in agreement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sure, yes.
Thank you. I'm Aslan Hussein. I have two questions. First, very personal. I mean, you talk about the criminalization of the movement, but also the leader before he was passing. My question here, how did he deal with it? The nature of his emotion during the critical period, because you can learn from that experience, that's one. Second, even though you stated just now that as if the movement is no longer exists in Turkey, a couple of years ago I was in Istanbul and asked two professors of mine, good friends of mine we were students together in New York, and then I asked them.
Hold it high.
Oh, okay, and then I asked them privately, what do you think about the movement? Are they still young? The leaders were all probably detained, right? But how about the younger people? Are they still doing the work? And I was told quietly, without using the name as you implied earlier, but could you expand on this issue, the younger generation who were not part of the leadership and were not detained by the government, they are still working, or are they still connecting with the rest of the world? And then the last one, my suggestion. There are so many schools and graduates of the movement across the world, including in my place. I'm from Aceh, Indonesia, where the tsunami happened. And one of my nephews actually went to the school. Exactly, they didn't teach Islam, but actually they walk Islam. So it's really amazing because I saw my nephew became very religious in the sense, even though religion was not taught at school. So probably you should create an organization allowing these graduates from around the world to connect with one another. This is probably another way of expanding the legacy of the great leader Fethullah Gülen. Allah yarhamu. Thank you.
Sure.
I think that's happening. More and more there are conferences, national, international, otherwise, the whole point and purpose of which is to do that. So absolutely agreed. As for Hoja Effendi, I can only give you my opinion, and it's one word: sabr, patience. Among his characteristics, he had an extraordinary calm, patient demeanor. Thank you. Sorry. And one of his last jihads was to convey that to his followers. I was at a Hizmet conference in Maryland in December of 2016, and you can imagine everyone is depressed as all get up because of what had happened. And he couldn't come, but one of his associates came from the retreat center in Pennsylvania and talked, and the emphasis that he kept making was on that word, on patience and trust, tawakkul, he had an enormous capacity for that. He believed it's all in Allah's hands. And I think right to the end. And that was for those whom he was trying to encourage not to despair. That was the message that he was very intent upon conveying.
Well, it's difficult to give an answer to your question, to be very honest. But I met Huzur Effendi in 2018, probably for the first time. And this 2016 crisis and 17, I could see people were so hopeless here, this and that. But in the moment you meet Huzur Effendi, he will give you an impression that this crisis is nothing actually. I mean, the kind of calm which is on his face, the kind of spiritual, on his face, that as if there's nothing. And what is remarkable is that he took everything on his own name actually. I mean, he did not allow anybody to make a protest, go here, do there, drum beating, blah, blah. But rather, as Dr. Ori said, that patience and the sabars, because nobody knows how to interpret as someone who greatly believes in a divine message, nobody knows how to interpret the divine message. Then probably he's always hope for a good life, the better future, the better humanities, which will basically come out. And to be very honest with you, that people like me, who is not very, I would say that I'm not very religious at all. I'm not good Muslim compared to many of you who are sitting here actually, to be honest with you. But if there's one thing, to be honest with you, that I'm thankful to Allah, is that this crisis happened in his lifetime. The crisis would happen without his lifetime. It would be very difficult which way the movement would have gone actually. But the way he managed the movement over the last 10 years, brought it back from the slumber and hopelessness. And today the movement is almost ready to run again actually. That's what I see, to be honest with you, wherever I go. So, that's what, visionary people, these kinds of people know how to respond. And they responded in very calm, very peaceful, and see to it that not a single aggressive response came from the Hizmet movement. And that basically gives a kind of the moral defeat to Erdogan. He was hoping some violence will come.
Absolutely.
And that did not happen. So that's a remarkable leadership. That's what I would like to say.
Rumi said to come whoever you are, but Fethullah Gülen told everybody to go.
Yeah.
Go whoever you are. Yes, and welcome everybody. Yeah, definitely.
One last?
We can have one more question, one last question.
Or not. Okay.
Let me just say then too, there are many of the youth who are actively involved in dialogue and things that are here joining us this evening as well. Most of them I see sitting in the back of the room, but they are very, very active everywhere, but here in Virginia and the DC area, very, very active. So I just wanted to give them a shout out, as they've been mentioned a couple of times. So proud of you guys.
I'll do just a brief closing. Yes. Thank you so much. We would like to thank our amazing panel for this important discussion, and to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Ori Z, Dr. Anwar Alam, and our moderator, Dr. Lyndsey Eksili, for being here and sharing your insights. For the center, since our first publication in September 2022, we have been seeing remarkable growth in CFIG's contributions to Rumi Forum, scholarly, academically, and over 35 individuals so far, including senior fellows, research fellows, scholars, associates, and book review contributors, have already enriched our monthly publications. And if you haven't had a chance, please check out our publications on your way out, and feel free to pick up any of them, including our today's panelist papers, and find our one-pager about our current academic year's contributors to CFIG. And as we continue to grow, please consider investing in Rumi Forum to help us sustain and expand the work at CFIG, ensuring the ongoing production of quality research and enriching public discourse. For those interested in supporting our mission, you can find a small flyer with a QR code that links to our donation page. Last but not least, we would like to thank to our hosts tonight, University of Southern California Capitol Campus, and to Sydney, who assisted us opening up this beautiful space, and for our catering that we will share light refreshments from. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome you to the back of the room to enjoy some light refreshments and continue our conversation there. So thank you so much for joining us, and good evening, everyone.